Good evening, everybody. My name is Travis Wodersky. I'm a welding engineer here with Miller Electric. We know there's countless different types of equipment, different options of equipment out there for you guys to choose from when it comes to your first set of welding equipment for your home garage or shop. And tonight we want to help you go through the process of some of the main questions that we hear time and time again on the people who are just getting started into welding on how do I choose the right welder. These set of questions that we're going to go through seem to come up all the time. So tonight I'm joined by Chris Rail. He's a product manager within Miller here. And we've also got James on the chat, who is going to be what you see as the moderator. He's going to be your guys' direct link to us. So if you guys have questions for us, he'll be able to let us know along the way so we can try to answer as many questions that you guys have live. Anything that we can't get to live, if it's going to be a little bit more detailed question, you'll see got the email up there on the screen. That'll be up throughout the presentation. But you're more than welcome to reach out to us either at shoptalklive@millerwelds.com if you got a more general question, info@millerwelds.com. And we'll try to answer any of your guys' questions. Even if we can't get to it live tonight, we'll go from there. So, Chris, do you want to take a couple seconds and introduce who you are?
Sure. Thanks, Travis. My name is Chris Rail. I'm the product manager at Miller Electric. I have been here for 34 years, and of those 34 years, the last 17 years, I've been the product manager for the Millermatic products. So over those years, I have talked to a lot of people, visited a lot of shops, answered a lot of questions. So hopefully I can share some of that knowledge with you and answer some of your questions that you may have on helping you determine which machine is the best machine for your shop.
Excellent. Like I said, my name's Travis Wodersky. My background is engineering. I've spent most of my time here at Miller on the road, either with customers or doing shows, events, things like that. James has spent a lot of his time doing the same in the moderation. So he'll be able to answer a lot of your questions. Again, if you guys have anything at all, this is going to be fairly fast paced. We want to keep it nice and short for you guys tonight and get as much information to you as we can. But again, if you guys have questions along the way, feel free to throw them out there in the chat or again to the email, and we'll try to get as many of those answered for you guys as we can. We want to make this as interactive for you as possible. Also, if you guys have any suggestions of what you'd like to see in these types of shows in the future, please email that into the shoptalklive@millerwelds.com as well, and that might end up being a future topic for us. So to go ahead and get started, we'll talk about, again, that main set of questions that we see time and time again. I've talked to a lot of customers throughout the years on a whole spectrum of different levels, people that have been in the industry for years and years, people who have just gotten started. And again, your equipment selection a lot of times comes down to these four main questions that you see on the screen of what is your project, your material, your power that you have to run the machine on, and what is the cost. So we'll break down each one of these sections a little bit on how that can drive you to which piece of equipment or pieces of equipment you may need that'll best suit your shop. And as we go through this, from the beginning here, I would ask that anybody that's on the line, if you have specific projects that you guys are working on, are you guys working on auto body rust repair? Are you guys TIG welding or looking at some aluminum project, aluminum material, anything like that? If you have projects in mind that fall into one of these categories, throw those out there on the chat and we'll kind of talk through what might be the best piece of equipment for you specifically. So again, if you guys have examples along the way of what you're working on, questions that you have, projects that you're working on and wonder what might be the best machine, feel free to throw those in the chat as well, and then we'll try to address those along the way as well. So the first main question that we see or tend to ask if we get somebody coming into an event that is unsure of where they need to go, what type of machine do they need, is a MIG welder right for me, is it TIG welder? The number one question that I'll ask on the road is, what is your project? That's typically going to point you in a direction of a class of machine. Do I need a TIG welder? Do I need a MIG welder? Do I need a stick welder? Do I need an engine drive? Do I need a plasma cutter? A lot of that's going to be based on what is your project. So I know, Chris, you've spent a lot of time on the road as well. Anything that you want to add to the project background?
Yeah, like I said, as far as projects can vary from anything. It could be from just making ornamental things for your garden to repairing a tractor to restoring a car, building an aluminum trailer, or building a raft for your pond or your lake. So like I said, it's a variety of different opportunities to weld with in your shop. The other thing is as far as your project, is it at your location, at your house all the time, or do you need to, go someplace else and, finish your project or weld someplace else also? Those are things to take into consideration too.
Sure. And as you guys are watching these are different customer submitted photos that were into our project gallery on millerwelds.com. So you can see a lot of different types of material. A lot of these are going to be some very in-depth aluminum projects or steel, some stainless. But again, anything from this is a four-wheeler quad style tank to a very impressive sculpture to you see some advanced lawnmowers in here, some trailers, different things like that. So a broad spectrum of different types of projects. So something like this where you've got some heavier plate, that might be a great application for either a MIG welder, depending on what you have, or flux core. That would really work out well versus some of these aluminum projects that are a lot more detailed would typically be types of projects that are going to push you more towards a TIG style machine. If you're looking for something that really looks aesthetically, on par, like that piece that's going to come up here, that stack of dimes TIG look. If you're looking for something that has that controllability and looking for something extremely detailed, a lot of times that's going to push you to that TIG style machine. One of the questions, Chris, that I see coming in from William Mitchell is, I need a welder that can be a MIG welder on stainless steel, small aluminum, steel, and that it's in the best budget. So that might be, depending on what you're doing, if you could expand on what kind of stainless you're looking to do, that may be able to be done with a MIG machine itself, or you may be better off looking at something like the Multimatic 220, where you could do the MIG welding on the steel. And if you've got a thin stainless project, that might be better off going to the TIG side of a machine like that. So if you've got some more information there, we could get a little bit more in detail on that for you. So again, coming back to that project dictating your type of machine, this is where you also might need to make a decision based on budget in the end as well. Like we just mentioned, there's a lot of projects like the rust repair on an auto body, something like that, that a MIG welding style machine is typically going to be your best option for that project. So you get less distortion, especially if you're just starting out. Not to say that you can't eliminate it with TIG, but a lot of times it takes a lot of operator skill to get there on really thin material, or a pulse style machine, something like that. But a machine like the Multimatic 220 or a multi-process style machine of any kind will really help you out in a lot of those situations where if you're working on a lot of stuff that is body panels with the MIG side, but then again, you're building some roll cages or things that are extremely detailed on the TIG side would really be, a better option. So at the end of that, looking at a 3-in-1 style machine might be a better option for you, cost-wise, floor space-wise, all of that, versus buying separate machines to do each of those projects.
Travis, we have a question here. It says, tips on welding dirty material with MIG and pulse MIG. What I can do is I can start out with that, and Travis, I'll let you
Sure.
add in at the end here. But the main thing about dirty material is the best thing you can do is to try to clean it the best that you can. The best thing is to do is to get a wire brush and try to get off the rust, try to get off the dirt, try to get off whatever contaminant is on the material. So that's the main thing that you definitely want to try and do. Another thing that you want to look at is what welding wire you're using. The welding wires have different composites inside of it, and you want to have a welding wire like an S6 wire that has more silicon in it that actually tries to get some more of the dust and dirt out of the weld and gets to the surface of your weld. So, those are some types of things you want to take a look at. As far as MIG and pulse MIG welding, Travis, what's your take on that?
I would agree with where you're going, especially if we didn't really ask the question if they're looking, we're assuming that the MIG welding side of it, that you're looking at steel. It would be even worse with aluminum. You want to make sure that material is clean. We hear a lot that a lot of guys want to stick weld because it's better with contamination than what MIG welding might be. And that's kind of a two-edged sword, even coming down to mill scale, that if it's there before you weld, it's there after you weld. It's just a matter of where did it go. So, the engineer in me is always going to say, clean it as best you can, get rid of it all. Obviously, that's not always necessarily feasible, but that's always going to be your best answer to getting the best weld is to remove all that contamination right from the start. It's going to weld out better in the end. Like I said, aluminum is going to be a lot more picky on that than what steel is going to be typically. From the grease, oil, all that kind of thing is really going to show up. So I would definitely agree with that. Coming back to one of the questions I saw fly by here of Bryant's mainly working on auto restoration and off-road. Would like to know if a multi-process 220 is a better option for him. Depends on what type of off-roading you're doing. If you're looking for anything that's got to have a certification stamp, some of those off-road projects, if you're doing a roll cage, things like that, some of those can pass being MIG welded. A lot of them, when you get to the higher end classes, have to be TIG welded. So if that's the case, if you're looking for something like that, or something that you can get a lot higher quality weld in chromoly tubing specifically, if that's where you're looking to go on the off-road eventually. Realistically, by the time you pair that with some body work, the 220 is probably going to be your best option, or a multi-process style machine like that. And the nice part about that machine in the go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say, and as far as output of the machine and what you're trying to do, the Multimatic 220 will have definitely the output that you need, versus some of the more higher end machines that have higher duty cycles. But yeah, the 220 will definitely do what you got to do.
And the other benefit there, like you say, is if you're in the off-road and want to take it with you and need to run it on a generator, or you have a smaller generator, something like that, you could run on the 120 side. We'll talk about that a little bit later coming on too. But you gain a lot of flexibility in a lot of these smaller frame machines, being able to run them on different power when you go on the road. So if we've got more of those specific projects, we can come back to that. But flowing into the next piece of that ties into the project is going to be, what material is that project made out of? Again, we talked about the main ones that we're going to see day in and day out are going to be steel, stainless steel, and aluminum. Steel and aluminum being kind of the top, especially in more of the home hobby style market. But getting into some stainless too, if we're doing some other work, or if you're doing some side jobs as well on the stainless side. A lot of those go to the TIG side for stainless, but I have done a lot of obviously MIG welding on the stainless side as well. But the main two I would say that we focus on in the home hobby market is going to be aluminum and steel. So we can do it either way. We can MIG weld it on both. We can TIG weld it on both. It's just a matter of coming back to the project question. Is it something we have an extreme detail need? We want that stack of dimes look. Is it something semi-production? We just want it to hold. Chris has got a spool gun there. That's a huge asset for a lot of repair work that we still see day in and day out, MIG welding that aluminum. So it's not to say that either one can't do it. It's just a matter of that material in combination with your project is really going to drive you to another better answer to what machine is right for you.
Like Travis mentioned, steel and aluminum. Typically, people always think aluminum, you need to TIG weld it. That was true, but a lot of advancements have been made with aluminum MIG welding and the products for the home hobbyist. So like Travis had mentioned, there is an option, depending on how are you going to do mostly steel and some aluminum, then a MIG machine would work for you with the option of a what they call a spool gun. I'll just hold it up here, you can see it. It's basically a 1 pound spool of wire goes inside the spool gun, and we're feeding wire like 6 inches out of the nozzle, so that way we're going to have good consistent wire feed. These guns also, if you're just doing occasional aluminum welding, it has what they call a direct connection. So what you'd have to do is you disconnect your MIG gun in the machine, put your spool gun into the output of the machine to get your power, and then when you switch between steel and aluminum, you need to use 100% argon for MIG welding, and for steel it's a 75-25 or 100% CO2 mix. So you'd have to physically change, your shielding gas around. It takes about maybe 5 minutes to do it, but for people who occasionally want to MIG weld aluminum, this is a good option for them.
Yep. One of the questions I saw come by was from Jonas of what small machine has the highest duty cycle. That's going to be a question based on what you're looking at. Are you looking at a MIG machine, a TIG machine, multi-process, and which process? Because they're all going to change a little bit on duty cycle versus the process itself. Even the same machine at 220 is going to have a different duty cycle on MIG versus TIG. So if you send us some more information on that, we can give you a little bit
Right.
better answer on
Right.
that.
Yeah, typically the machines, the smaller machines, those are the output is rated on a 20% duty cycle. So out of every 10 minutes of welding, it can weld for 2 minutes and it needs to rest for 8 minutes. That's what those machines are rated at. Some of the larger all-in-one home machines, those are based off of more of a 60% duty cycle, which is a little bit more for people who are welding for a living or needing to weld thicker gauge material.
Yeah, and that's something to keep in mind on duty cycle. It's a number we talk about. It's where a lot of manufacturers are going to classify machines, but it's like statistics. There's ways to bend those numbers. If you look at most of our machines, they're rated at a higher temperature, which changes duty cycle quite a bit in the end. But again, like Chris said, it's a sliding scale. Every machine's going to be 100% duty cycle somewhere. It's just a matter of where. So if you look at one machine might be 60%, so is the next machine, but one's 60% at 200 amps versus 400 amps. Or if you look at one that's 60%, at a lower number than what the machine is at a higher number, you've got to look at both the percentage and the amperage to get a fair comparison. And again, keep in mind that temperature differentiation of where is that rated, because there's not a standard scale that every manufacturer has to be, apples to apples when they compare those duty cycle numbers. A lot of these home hobby style machines that we have today, or small fabrication style machines, even a lot of these machines get put into fab shops and run all day long, as a single shift a day kind of machine versus a 3 shift a day machine. And it's still very difficult to hit that duty cycle, unless you're welding on some extremely thick plate for long, long periods of time. So the machines are going to be designed for what the 80 of those users that are using it are going to be welding on. Now, obviously, if you're working on something a little bit heavier, you might be better off jumping up to a bigger machine. But a lot of these, if you're welding a lot of 1/8 inch all day long kind of thing, most of these machines you would struggle to hit duty cycle on across the board. So just something to keep in mind there on duty cycle. For Jonas, we're looking at multi-process TIG machine on 220-volt single phase. So again, it's coming back to what are you looking for. So one of the big determinants on a multi-process machine, even if you take duty cycle aside for a second, would be, do you want the ability to weld on aluminum? So that's going to be in the small frame lineup. Something like the 220 is going to be the machine that fits that bill. Now, if you're not looking to do aluminum on the TIG side, then you've got a little bit more option on what multi-process machine might be the better duty cycle machine, because we could go all the way up to something like 255 or even larger if you needed. But in these smaller machines, that machine is truly going to be the one that does it all. And that duty cycle is going to be, again, designed for that home hobby, garage, small fabrication style environment. And I've tried to hit it on the road. And like I said, it takes a fair amount of welding and 1/4 inch to try to hit that duty cycle. So. Again, we appreciate all the feedback coming through here. Trying to answer as many questions as we can for you guys here. If we don't get to a question, if you've got something that is a little bit more in depth, again, it's Shop Talk Live at millerwelds.com, and we'll try to answer it that way. When this is over, you can also comment on the video itself on YouTube. James and I will be looking through those comments periodically as well, answering some of those questions for you there if we don't get to it here live. So coming into the next question that we're typically going to ask, and it's going to be one that we've already seen pop up here, we've talked about quite a bit here, is going to be power input into these machines. Now, in most of the home hobby market, light fabrication market, it's going to be 120 or 240. A strong percentage of shops, above 50%, we're seeing now have 240-volt capability. And what the big difference with these machines versus machines of years past, it's a lot easier to get 240 volts at 30 amps than it was to get an old transformer style machine that needed 130 amps to get the same amount of current out of that machine. So to have 240 capability is a lot more easily attainable for most people in their home garage versus what it used to be trying to draw the whole panel off your entire house to run a machine. But a lot of home garages still don't have that, and a lot of groups are looking to take these on the road. You guys were saying that they were in the off-road or motorsports, things like that. A lot of times you want a machine in the trailer that you're going to run off a generator to do repair work. Again, you might be looking at a machine that will run both 120 or 240 as being the best option for you. And again, most of these smaller machines now run that way, but it's definitely something to keep in mind where you don't want to limit yourself if you have the capability of getting a machine that will do both versus a smaller machine that will only run 120, and then you lock yourself into a window.
Right. So typically, originally we had a 120 machine or a 240. So going to shows, talking to people, they said, I want to buy a welding machine. Say, what kind of power do you have in your garage or your shop? They say I have 120. So right away, you only have one machine really that you had to offer them. That was a 140 amp type of machine. But then they, now with our newer technology, and otherwise people would say, well, I got 120 today, but now down the road I want to put 240 in my shop. Well, now we have technology called MVP technology, or multi-voltage plug. And what this is on the end of the cord, we have a little collar. Again, I'll try to show it here. Just a little collar, and we have a 115 volt plug. You just simply disconnect this 120 volt plug, take this 240 volt plug right here, just line up, put the plug on it, tighten your collar. Now the machine is linked for 230 or 240. So the one thing when you have it plugged into 120, power in is power out. So when you have it plugged in 120 volts, you have limited in power in, so you have less output out. So basically on 120 power, you can weld up to 3/16 material, like on our Millimatic 211, or on our 211, if you have it plugged into 230, now this machine has the capability of welding up to 3/8 material. So again, another nice feature that we have, with our products are out there is you can, have multiple voltages for you in your shop, or if you have to take it on the road. And all these smaller machines are also compatible with generators, as Travis was talking about before.
Yep, and we've got a couple questions coming in kind of around both of these that we can talk to. So Jonas is back with how do most of these smaller machines run on generator power? Excuse me. For the most part, if you're looking at one of these machines that is 120, 240 capable, chances are it's going to be an inverter style machine. And those machines are across the board going to run better off a generator versus what an older style machine would do. Where in those older transformer style machines, you've got dirty power in a generator. So, if you get a spike in power, you're going to see that come out in the machine arc very easily. Excuse me. These newer style machines will give and take a little bit for some fluctuation in that generator power. So you're going to see a much more consistent weld output on these newer style machines than what you would on the older ones. Right. Another comment that we had come through was just plug it into the dryer outlet for 240. Yes and no. And so it depends on what machine you have and what dryer plug you have. So you see there the plug Chris had and the plug that's in our power diagram here that looks like a bigger 115 plug is a 6-50. That's a 50 amp style typical welder plug. And you'll see that those machines don't come with the old crow's foot angled like most of your dryers are probably set up with. And that's an amperage to make sure that you have enough power there. The wires going there are not too small. So NEMA code is why we got away from including that crow's foot plug into the MVP lineup. So if you have 240 power there and it's adequate, you'll have to make an adapter to go from this style plug to that crow's foot. You can't buy it directly for the machine. And again, that was coming down to welding code or the electrical code on why that is, because they didn't want people plugging a machine that's asking for 50 amps into an outlet that can only give them 30 and creating some issues there. So it is doable. Just make sure you have the correct power to start with.
Another thing I'd like to get back to the conversation about generator wattage. Our 120 volt machines that run on generators, you're looking at probably around a generator that produces 4,500 watts and to get rated output. And if you would go up to the 240 volt machine, around a 10 kW generator is what is required to get rated output on those machines. Now, if you put them on smaller generators, will they run? Yes, but the maximum output will be reduced.
One of the questions we had come in, Chris, is where does the 215 stand in Miller's arsenal? as far as the
Okay.
multi-process style machine?
That's a good question. The Multimatic 215 has been around for probably 5 years now, and this is a good multi-process, entry-level multi-process for people, for the guy at home in their shop, or for people who want to take it on the road and do some mobile work. It's a nice MIG stick DC lift arc TIG, so it does steel and stainless steel. So it's a very nice machine. It has capabilities to work with that spool gun I was just talking to you about. And as far as doing projects around the house, it has definitely enough power that you need to work for projects around the home. The other product that we have is we just came out with last year was a Multimatic 235, which is in a larger case. This is more of a machine that's geared more towards people who are welding for a living, who want to use a 12-inch spool of wire to get more productivity. It has a 15-foot gun, so you have a larger work envelope. So those are some of the features that the Multimatic 235 has. I kind of look at the Multimatic 235 as a big brother to the Multimatic 215, but for your applications for using at the home, the 215 is a very good machine. If for TIG welding, you want to do steel and stainless. It does not do AC TIG for aluminum.
And that's going to be the big differentiator there between the 215 and the 220. 220 is kind of the bigger brother that will do AC and has that capability. The rest of their outputs are going to be similar, within that platform. Another question that we had come in on the power side of things is, what about running one of these on 115 volts versus 120? So that's going to be a 15 amp breaker off your panel versus a 20. A lot of times that's going to mean you have 14 gauge wiring your wall versus 20 or versus 12. And you're going to be limited on what you can get out before that breaker pops. So depending on your project, you might be able to run it on that 115 breaker for a little bit or on a very light project, but the machines are typically going to be designed to be running on a 20 amp breaker to give you what it's rated for on the 120 side.
Okay. So welding thinner gauge materials will work just fine on 115 volt breaker.
And another thing to keep in mind, I know we had a comment come through on putting a 240 volt extension cord to get out of your house into the garage. And it's going to be the same comment for me across the board, whether it's 240 volt, whether it's 120. It's going to be a little bit more prevalent probably on 120. If you're going to run an extension cord, make sure it's a heavy extension cord. If you try to put a 120 circuit on a very thin, extension cord that's made for Christmas lights, it's not going to work. It's going to pop. Cord's going to get hot. You could create some bigger issues. So you want to make sure that you've got a nice heavy gauge cord on either one if you're going to run an extension cord to get that output, or you're going to start seeing some issues.
Another question we have regarding output power of a Trailblazer. The Bobcat and Trailblazer, those machines have an output of roughly 12 kW.
For the EFI models, so you'll get a little bit less for the carbureted ones, but they're also extremely clean as far as generator power goes. But again, these machines themselves, if you're plugging into them on the secondary side, compensate for a lot of that dirty power. But if you compare one of those machines today versus 10 years ago, the cleanliness of the power curve that you're going to see today is nothing like what it used to be, even a few years ago. So, great questions there. And again, that's going to be kind of the other realm of the power question is 120, 240 both. Or on a machine like that, do you need to create your own power? Do you want something that you can take into the field and need to buy a welder generator that will create that power for you? So that's another question to drive you to what's the right machine for you. The last question in our lineup here, like I said, we're going to try to keep this fairly brief for you guys as we have a lot of these questions keep coming in. We'll stay on and answer some of them as long as you guys are willing to stick around, from my end anyway. I can't speak for the other guys here, but again, we'll answer them after the fact too if we can. But for the budget side of things, obviously, this is going to be a question as you're considering equipment of, does it make sense to spend a little bit more money on a machine from the start? Does it make more sense for you to buy an entry-level machine, get comfortable with it, get used to it, and then potentially trade it out as you get more familiar with welding itself and, keep a MIG machine till you need TIG capability and then buy a TIG machine later on, or a multi-process machine later on in order to fit it into your budget, and that's all fine. It's just going to be a question that you have to ask in the beginning of, what is truly your budget? Do you want to spend the money on a machine from the beginning? Do you want to upgrade it later on? There's a lot of ways you can take that. One caution that even if I take the Miller logo off my shirt that I would give anybody across the board is buying equipment that's going to have, some parts that, in 5 years, if something breaks, you can fix it. That there's going to be support available, things like that, because there is a lot of off-brand equipment coming into the market that might last a week and then blow up and then you're replacing it again. So if you look at that type of equipment from a budget perspective, typically in the end, you're not going to save any money by the time you end up buying 2 or 3 machines to get the lifespan out of, what you easily could have got out of any brand name type of equipment.
A question here came in. What's the best machine to build stock car chassis and roll cages with mild steel? As far as the products that we have, here locally in around Appleton area, I visit a lot of race shops. And as far as a Millermatic 211, if plugging it into it has definitely the plenty of power to be able to weld the roll cages and the chassis. As far as the material thickness that is made out of, the 211 definitely has the capability of doing that. But something else to take into consideration outside of that is, going and moving around. What's your work envelope? Welding in a race car chassis and stuff like that, you need, a lot of reach. So, some of these smaller machines, they only have a single drive roll in it. So these machines only come with a 10-foot gun. Moving up to the larger machines, it also definitely have plenty of the power that you need to weld these chassis, but it also has an industrial 4-drive or 2-drive roll system in it, which allows you to feed wire through a 15-foot gun. So, looking if you want to spend more time welding, maybe move up to a machine that has a 15-foot gun, or if you don't mind taking your machine and moving it around the car in your work cell a little bit more often, the Millermatic 211 would be just a fine product for that also.
And if you look at that market, I've personally been into a lot of the NASCAR shops and pulled the bigger equipment out and replaced it with the 211s, the 220s, in essentially the entire shop, other than a couple bigger TIG machines that they had in there. And the same thing with those off-road markets, whether they're the trophy truck style machines and stuff like that, obviously, where you get to the point where they got to do the chrome moly on the tube. Most of them are TIG welding it and running the multi-process machine, but a lot of them are still running these smaller frame machines like the 211 or the 220 on the secondary concern that they can throw them in the trailer and take them with them on the weekend without taking up a whole lot of space in the truck, a weight into the truck, that kind of thing. We've had a few questions come through from Photo on the 235 capability on, do we ever plan on taking it to 120? Could we take that to 5/16 in a single pass? So 2 separate questions there. The 235 is a 240 volt machine. It will not go down to the 120 side of things. And as far as 5/16 in a single pass, if you're looking at doing that, it's a power in, power out thing, like Chris was talking a little bit earlier. If you look at all the older transformer style machines that ran on 120, those were typically topping out at 1/8 inch, maybe 3/16. Most of them you'd struggle to hit 90 amps output. On some of these newer transformer-less machines going into an inverter style, they're more electrically efficient. We're getting a little bit more power out of those machines to where we can make a quality 1/4 inch weld in a single pass. But realistically, to think that you could get that up to 5/16 in the future is quite a long shot on ever being able to be electrically efficient. You're just a limitation of power in, power out. And to get a high quality weld on that thickness of material, even if you went down the road of trying to look at preheat, things like that, take that aside and look at what the machine can do on its own. I'm going to tell you that you probably will never see a 120 machine with a 5/16 single pass rating
No.
from any manufacturer, let alone ours. Like I say, it's just a thickness in, thickness out issue.
Okay, another question here. What would be the benefit of a dedicated machine versus multi-process? Cost aside, can a dedicated machine do anything a multi-process can't? Right now, on the MIG side of things and stick side of things, I would have to say the dedicated machines in this market really cannot do anything more than what the multi-process can, or vice versa. The main difference is, if we put aside cost, is space constraints. Okay, in your garage, how much room do you really have? In my garage, I have a lot of stuff in there, including snow blowers, lawn mowers, things like that. So
Projects that need to be finished.
Projects that need to be done right. So as far as on, let's say a Multimatic 220 versus a Multimatic 220 versus a Millermatic 211. On the MIG side, the 211 and the Multimatic 220 are virtually the same as far as feature sets. They both have auto set. They both have auto set for steel with 75-25, 100% CO2. The footprint is very similar. But as far as again, it's how many machines do you want to have in your shop? Do you want to have a dedicated MIG machine? Do you want to have a dedicated TIG machine?
And that's coming back to the fact that you're not taking budget completely aside. If you take a Dynasty 280 and try to compare it to what one of these other machines would do, you're not in the same ballpark, even though you might be in the same similar footprint. So you want to compare apples to apples there on cost too as well. But like you guys said, the 211 versus 220. It's going to be a limitation on what do you truly need. The machines themselves are going to be very, very close. Don, we have passed along your comment that we need to bring back the bobbleheads. We'll pass it along again. So we appreciate you coming back. Hopefully over the course of these video series that we see you guys coming back again. So again, Don is one of the names I've seen come up a couple times. So we appreciate you guys coming back for these. Again, we'll try to keep this fairly short for you guys. We'll stick around and answer some more questions for you, but we've got through the main 4 questions that we typically try to ask and answer if we get somebody coming into a show, if we're on the road, of how do I pick the right machine for me? That's the steps that I would go through. I would look at what is my project? What type of machine do I want? Do I want a MIG machine, a TIG machine? Do I want to do it all? The cost associated with that. The materials are going to be a big limitation, especially when it comes to the multi-process machines. The number one there being, do you want to weld aluminum on the TIG side? That's going to be a differentiator across the board, where a lot of the Multimatic machines don't have that capability. So make sure and keep that in mind. But again, if you are doing aluminum repair on trailers, things like that, a spool gun might be the right option for you anyway. And most of those machines are going to be capable of that. And then the last one being the power. Do you want to run on 120, 240? Do you want to take it with you? Do you want to make your own power? Those are kind of the correct questions to steer you in the right direction of what to look at. And at the end of the day, how much do you want to spend? Do you want to start out small, work your way up, start from the top to begin with? That's all up to you and what your budget will dictate there. So another point to keep in mind. So again, for anybody that's going to drop off, we appreciate your time today. We will stick around. At least I will stick around. I don't want to talk for Chris, but we'll stick around and answer some more questions. Here. And again, if we don't get to them, feel free to comment on this video on YouTube. That shoptalklive@millerwelds.com email will come back to us. We'll answer it there as well. And again, if you guys have topics that you want to see in the future for these, on whatever it might be, a certain machine, a certain welding process, a wire, whatever welding question you might have, throw that out to that shoptalklive@millerwelds.com email as well, and we'll try to gear these in the future to content that you guys are looking for. So again, we appreciate your time tonight, and we'll keep filtering through a couple more of these questions before we take off. But again, I wanted to thank you guys for stopping by.
We have time for another question, Travis?
We do. One of the questions I see here from Jonas is, how do the smaller inverters hold up over time with a lot of use? And Chris, you're kind of the inside business guy, but what I've seen from the outside looking in is actually those machines that get used a lot every day actually hold up better long-term than the machines that never get used. So one of the things with the electrical components inside some of these machines, if you buy a machine, sit it on the shelf for 5 years, never power it on, that is much, much worse than getting it up to temperature and running at output all day long. As long as you're not burning it up, obviously. But not welding is not being powered up. So even if it's a machine that you guys have today that's an inverter base and you don't use it but once or twice a year, I would make a habit of going out there every couple of weeks, once a month, something like that, powering it up, letting it turn on, power running through it is going to help. But to answer your question, those machines that typically run a lot during the day do better in the long run than what they would if they got used here and there.
And also, Miller's been making inverter power supplies on the industrial side for many, many years. I've been in a lot of those locations and facilities, and I see machines, inverter machines that are over 20 years old, still running day in, day out. Since then, inverter technology has improved, and thus allowing us to bring it into the smaller machines. So as far as the technology and the circuitry and the components we're using today is even more robust and stronger than what we were using 20, 25 years ago in the other inverters that are still running every day. So as far as the wondering, is an inverter just as reliable as a transformer based machine? I'd have to say they're just as dependable and give you a lot more benefits as far as weight, arc performance than the transformer based machines.
Yeah, and like Chris said, it's not a new technology, and that's something that we hear quite a bit because it's new to the less expensive realm of welding equipment. We've had inverters on the market since the late 80s, early 90s. But back then, the technology was expensive. I mean, you look at a 75-inch TV 10 years ago versus what they cost now. Not even on the same planet as far as cost goes. And the electronics and the welders was the same way. So back then, it was equipment that you had to have a need for what that machine could do to afford it, to pay for it, to make the money back. Where now the electronics have got to the point where we can include those in these home hobby style and less expensive machines versus that high end, industrial only market that it traditionally had played in for the last 20 plus years. MIG welding tips getting dirty is a constant issue. I guess part of the question on that would be what constitutes dirty? Are you sticking the tip a lot? Do you feel it chatter? Do you have a lot of spatter? Typically, if you've got a lot of spatter that's sticking in the nozzle, you might have a settings issue. You might have a little bit too much voltage, something like that, where you're getting excessive spatter sticking in that nozzle. If it's a pulse machine, it could be a variation of different issues happening inside that tip that feel like it's getting dirty and chattering. So again, that could be coming back to you. What is your specific dirty scenario? So let us know what that looks like. Just looking through you guys' comments here. Does the 211 take a spool gun for aluminum or stainless? And that's a good comment on the aluminum stainless side of things. So a lot of people assume that a spool gun is only for aluminum, and that's not necessarily the case. Stainless is the other big option that we see it. We also see it in some more of the industrial equipment on, say something like a 252 or a 255, where you want a 38-foot spool gun on there to take up inside a combine hopper or something like that to get extended range or length out of your gun. Those will run just fine on most of these machines, but that stainless cost steel can be run through them as well. So, Chris, do you want to talk to the 211 a little bit on what you would be looking at for a spool gun?
Yeah, the 211 is compatible with two spool guns, the Spoolmate 100 and the Spoolmate 150. The difference between those two spool guns is the Spoolmate 100 has a lower motor speed in it. So for aluminum, it's only compatible with like a 4000 series aluminum, and the gun is, I want to say, 12 feet long. The Spoolmate 150 has a larger barrel on it, higher amperage, and it also has a motor in it with a higher wire feed speed, so it'll allow you to feed and use 5000 series aluminum, which requires higher wire feed speeds to repair aluminum or fix or weld aluminum than the 4000 series. And that gun comes with a 20-foot cable on it. So like Travis said before, if you need extended reach, the Spoolmate 150, you can put stainless steel, 4000, 5000 series aluminum in it, but you also have the capability of going 20 feet away from your machine as well.
Yep. And then, as we went through some of the comments here, we see a lot of you are already using Miller equipment today, so we appreciate that. Also some questions asking about different promotions, rebates, that kind of thing. One thing we do have going on right now is a 220 ACDC chance to win promotion where, excuse me, if you've got
Promotion, right?
a piece of equipment that you're using of ours, you submit a photo to that of the equipment that you use today. Go online, email that photo in, and that will register you to win. That's going to be a random drawing for that. So make sure you guys go on millerwelds.com. Check that out. You'll be able to see it scrolling through the headline there on the top of the main page. Find your way to that promotion. So make sure you guys check that out as well. And we appreciate what you guys are doing for us. And hopefully that equipment's holding up for you. So thanks again for joining. Can you weld cast aluminum with a spool gun? It depends on a lot of that depends on the cast. Some of it will come down to how dirty is the cast. Some of it will come down to the operator level. So cast on its own is typically not quite as easy to weld as other types of material because it's essentially dirty, especially if it's older cast. If it's something that's been around an engine or oil for years and years, it's extremely porous. So it likes to suck up contamination, and as you start welding on it, it likes to bubble a lot of that contamination to the surface. So, spool gun aside, it may take a little bit more care and finesse, but one of the points to keep in mind there is exactly what Chris just mentioned on what type of aluminum can those spool guns run. So some of them can only run 4,000, some of them can run 4 and 5,000. That's going to come into combination with what is your cast, what type of cast, what type of wire is the correct wire to weld that with. So obviously, if you've got some cast that needs a 5,000 series wire, it may be able to be done with one spool gun, but not another. So make sure you have the correct wire in mind when you look at your machine on whether that spool gun will run it or not. But, in general, can a cast be welded with a spool gun? Absolutely. As long as you've got the right parameters, as far as what wire are you running, how are you doing it, that kind of thing. Not going to weld great, typically, but it can be done.
No.
And that holds true on steel. Steel cast is just as fun to weld. What about those of you who have no machine yet? I'm double checking this so I don't tell you something that's wrong. So while I'm looking at that, we'll see if we have another one that Chris can answer while I'm staring at my website. Appreciate the show. Open your eyes at 235, so we appreciate that. Hopefully that machine will work out for you.
I guess while you're looking for a question, something else I can mention, Travis, a difference between some of our machines, like when we're talking some of the smaller machines, like a Millmatic 211, a 215, the Millmatic 220, the ones that have a 10-foot gun. And the reason is those machines, the drive motors inside, have what they call a single drive roll. So you just have one drive roll and then an idler roll comes on top of it. This drive roll will have multiple grooves in it. So if you're using 023 wire, 030, 035 wire, or a V-knurled, if you're using flux cord wire, you just simply take one drive roll. You can weld all those different types of wire diameters and types. When you move up to the larger size machines like the Multimatic 235, the Millmatic 252, Millmatic 255, those have an industrial 2-drive roll system, which allows you to feed wire through a 15-foot gun. And those come with what we call the industrial 2-drive roll system. So you have 2 drive rolls, you have a drive roll on the top, you have a drive roll on the bottom, and the wire goes right between it. So what that does is creates more surface area, gets more grip on the wire, and allows you to feed that wire 15 feet through a gun and have no issues as far as inconsistencies or wire wandering.
And then for the rebate, I'm going to tell you to go and look through the wording on the entry. Other than that, bought the 220 ACDC, love it. We appreciate that. One of the questions that we had come through on the extension cord question, the 120 sizing, that came from Photo. If you can send that question into Shop Talk Live at millerwelds.com, we'll walk through that one with you in a little bit more detail to make sure you get the right answer to that.
Otherwise, if you go to millerwelds.com, there's a section for owner's manuals. You can just click on the owner's manual. There's a chart in there regarding, power cord length, sizes, depending on the machine.
Chris Rail, any relation to rail trucking in Marshfield? I think that every time I drive down the road and see one of the trucks.
That is a great question. I always say if I was related, I probably would be working here. But so unfortunately, no relation whatsoever. Basically Marshfield, for those who don't know, is roughly 100 miles from Appleton. I've been here, like I said, at Miller Electric for 34 years, and it seems like it was yesterday that I walked in the doors back in 1987 for my first day of work here.
Big Potato just came through with, is a recessed tip needed for pulse MIG steel? Is it needed? Not necessarily, but a lot of them are going to be out of the box. But like a lot of the pipe equipment, you'll actually run a flush nozzle in tip. The reason why most of them are recessed is the fact of you're generating a lot more heat. It's also going to be why if you look at a machine like the 255 that will pulse, it's going to have heavier duty consumables in it than what you've seen on these machines in the past. So if you start pulse welding with it, if I'm running 200 amps, I might be 500-600 amps on the top side and then letting that cool. And those smaller diameter, less heavy duty consumables would heat up quicker. You look at a contact tip, you've got copper that is expanding on the outside diameter, but also might be shrinking on the inside diameter. And your wire is going to do that at a different rate than what the copper is because it's steel. And if you don't have that heavy duty enough piece of copper, just that expansion and contraction could cause some chatter. It can also start causing some micro arcing in the tip that leads you to feeling a chatter in the gun. And you are also going to see more reflection of heat off from the surface. So all of those things lead us to heavier duty copper front end on those pulse machines. Most of them are going to come out of the box with a recessed tip to try to keep you away from a little bit of that heat coming off from that puddle. But to say, is it required? Not necessarily, but that's why most of them are going to come with it.
On our current Miller-Matic machines that have pulse capabilities, those guns come with the contact tip that is flush. And the reason we do that is because when we send it out, we do not know how that customer is going to be using the machine. So you could have somebody buying a Miller-Matic 255 and they're just using it for short arc or welding thin gauge material. But then you also might have a customer who is pulse welding, and then that way they do need the thicker tip, and you want to have it flush. So having it flush with the end of the nozzle is a happy medium between what customer is going to be using it. But once the customer starts using it, then they will determine what contact tip is going to be the best. And we do that. All the contact tips are the same length. We just buy different length nozzles to either make the tip extending out the end for short arc, flush, or recess for pulse welding.
One of them we had from Darren, beginner machine for the classic auto resto. Depends on what you're looking to do, I would say. Most of the older sheet metal is a lot thicker, so we do see some people getting into TIG machines in that market. But for general purpose rust repair, body panel repair, most of that's going to be a MIG machine. Obviously, on body panels, you don't need a big machine. So it could be any of these machines across the board from the 141 on up. If you're looking at just that sheet metal type of work, you start looking at some frame repair or that kind of thing, I would probably start looking at the 211 and up. For me, I want to make sure I have enough power there in the machine. If I want to do a frame, something like that, some custom fab on anything like that, I want to have enough power there to do it on the 230 side versus the 120 side. But if you're just looking at doing body panel resto, you could pretty much look across the board on any of these machines. Is AccuLock recommended? I'm assuming that's also going back to your original question on Andy, I'll get to your comment. Thank you. On is Aculock recommended for pulse? Um, Typically, that's what you're going to see on a lot of these smaller frame machines, and even getting into some more of the industrial equipment. Aculock is available. You know, you can look at a tip on the MDX gun. It's going to be very similar, but it's going to be a lighter duty version of those consumables. Again, that the Aculock set that comes on them is going to be heavier duty for the pulse machines. But not only are you getting heavy duty front end consumables, you're also getting a liner that loads from the front and locks into the pin on the back. So the second function that we're really truly getting, and I've got a picture of this one if we go to this page, look at the gun here, where you're loading the liner from the front end, it locks into this pin on the back side, and then you're eliminating the different length liner issue, because if you coil this gun up in one direction, the liner is going to get shorter because it's a steel coil. You coil it up the other way, it's truly going to get a little bit longer. So that has created a lot of feeding issue over the years that people don't realize. So that Aculock system, you know, between that and between the tips, is going to be something that you'll see on these machines for pulse. Is it required? No. There's a lot of different style tips out there that we have in-house, even, you know, the center fire and different ones that you could use that are heavier duty pieces of copper. But what I want to caution you on is going back, like I said, could you truly put that lighter duty gun on the machine? Yeah, you could put a gun that came off a 140 on the front of a 255. You're just going to melt it down in about a half a second, and you're going to see a lot of feeding issues right away. So to say, is it required? No, but it is, in my mind, the best set that are coming on these out of the box for what we're doing. And I really like this gun with the ball and socket on the back side of it, which you don't really realize is a whole lot more comfortable until you start using it all day long. Coming back to Andy on the question of my beard, thank you for that. This is actually trimmed versus anybody who's been on these in the last year. So we appreciate that, Andy, and we'll look forward to that in a real garage coming up. Let's see if we got a couple more questions here that you guys are hanging on for. Most of you are still here, so are we. We appreciate your time. And hopefully we are getting some questions answered for you guys that you've found over the night. A water cooler or not for a TIG machine working with Inconel, Manel aircraft. Most likely you're going to be in a dedicated TIG machine, something like the Dynasty, I would say, if you're in the aircraft market. Is a water cooler required? Depends on how thick of stuff you're welding on. I would say aviation, you're probably thinner material, but what you're really getting for most operators in that scenario is a much more comfortable, smaller torch. So if you need access, things like that, a lot of times you can get a lot more power out of a lot smaller torch, be more comfortable using a water cooler. So a lot of times operator comfort is what's dictating that. Our recommendation typically is going to be, if you're above 200 amps or near 200 amps a lot, that's when we're really going to start recommending water cooled as a necessity to not get a torch that's 2 inches in diameter, versus most of the smaller, lighter gauge market are doing it for operator comfort and access based on a smaller torch. Yeah, if you're looking at 100 amps, water cooled is not necessary, but you're going to get a lot smaller torch. You regret selling all your Miller welding equipment back in the 90s. We all make mistakes. You can rebuild that. Questions are coming slower, so we must be doing our jobs. So we'll wait around here a couple more minutes for you guys. Again, we appreciate your time tonight. Anything that we don't get to, Shop Talk Live, MillerWelds.com. Same thing with any content that you guys would like to see in the future. Let us know.
Right.
Bobbleheads noted.
Yep. Got another question here, Travis, on flow rate for C10 for MIG welding versus pulse welding. Me personally, I just set it typically the same, 25, 30 CFH is where I usually set it for. Travis, do you have any other thoughts or feedback on
Yeah, I
that?
would say that's pretty typical. That flow rate is actually helping cool your consumables as well, especially on the Aculock style tail that's on that piece. But as far as making a quality weld, does it have to change? Not necessarily, unless
Right.
potentially if your positioning's changing or something where you are losing gas, or you go into a different style joint where if you're going to an open piece of pipe or something like that, where your gas is going to flow away from you versus being balled up, that could dictate it, but the process itself is not necessarily going to. And that comment coming back to C10 MIG versus pulse, that's coming back to a machine like the 255 where it has MIG, regular short circuit parameters built into it to short circuit weld with C10 versus the typical C25, and then be able to pull that same trigger for changing the program over to going to pulse without having to change your bottle of gas on the backside. So an extremely detailed machine if you're looking to do different processes, different welds quite a bit. Give you a lot of flexibility within your shop off typically that C10 bottle of gas, and then if you're going to run a dual on a Multimatic with that 100% argon, or even on a MIG machine, if you wanted 100% argon to run silicon bronze, something like that, you could do the rest of it with C10. So very flexible machine there, and that is not a typo.
Right.
Trying to
One
get it
thing
all
I
back.
will
Well, we
notice
appreciate that.
right, on flow rate, I have seen some situations where the flow rate's set too high. And what happens is that really creates turbulence in the arc and actually can draw impurities into the weld, which can give you pinholes, porosity in the welds, inconsistent arc lengths and stuff. So, some is good, more is not better when it comes to welding.
Best choice to replace an older Syncrowave 250 depends on a couple of the questions here again. You could potentially replace it with a new Syncrowave, depending on the options that you're looking for. I'd be looking at something like the Syncrowave or potentially a Dynasty 280. If you look at those machines side by side, that 280 is well going to outperform what the 250 Syncrowave would have done. But the new Syncrowave has come a long way as well. It's going to be a few option changes there between the two, and then some cost as well. Chris, coming into your wheelhouse, they bought a 220. Can't handle the big bottles. Any thoughts there?
The Multimatic 220 they bought and can't
Correct.
handle the large bottles.
Yes.
My answer here all the time is you bought a welding machine and you're a fabricator. So I would have to say come out with your own your cart design and to come up to something that's going to meet the needs for you and your space constraints. The reason why we don't have a machine, a cart that can support that large bottle is because the Multimatic 220 is so light that it really doesn't, can't support that cart. Well, that cart cannot support that bottle. So
yeah, when you start looking at it from a stability perspective, and when we got to smash it into a wall like it's been driving around in a truck cross country, without tipping over, that all becomes much heavier when your bottle outweighs your machine and your cart put together. Right. Especially when you start looking at a dual cylinder version. Since you did say cylinders, I'm wondering if you have the 220 AC/DC on a dual cart, that becomes even more of a rocket when you have two of those on the back of it. Used Hobart in Vietnam. Appreciate, I'm assuming, your service for that to start off with, and then that is a Hobart. Hobart is a sister company of ours, so we also appreciate that business. Water with cooled machine, long beads, and aircraft job, ceramic cups or clear, not walking the cup. Clear cups are clear for a while. You start doing a lot of, especially anything you're doing AC is going to tear them up. But if you're doing that stuff on DC, a lot of times those glass cups will last a long time. A lot of that's going to come down to operator preference. Is one going to outperform the other from a weld quality perspective? Probably not, obviously, unless you have a clear cup that you can see your weld a lot better in a certain joint configuration. Not walking the cup coming back, I'm assuming, to the fact that you get one of them hot, they're easier to break. But I would say across the board, a lot of that will come down to just your operator preference. The biggest thing for TIG for me that a lot of people don't realize comes back to what Chris had mentioned a little bit ago on gas flow rate. Too high or too low. So as your cup changes, the one thing that I would run all the time, as long as you got room for it, is going to be a gas lens. You're going to get a lot better coverage across the board than you would with a standard set of consumables there. So I would always be running that. But you also have to keep in mind as your cup gets bigger, your gas flow rate needed is going to change. You don't want to run, the same flow rate on a 1/4 inch diameter cup that you would on an 1 1/4 inch diameter cup that you're trying to cool a bunch of stainless or Manel, Inconel, something like that. So make sure your flow rate is rated to the cup that you're using, and you should be just fine. For the corners, yep, coming back to the clear cup and again, the gas lens are going to be your best help on those. But again, especially if you're not in something where the AC is chewing them up and clouding them up, either one's going to work just fine for you. It's just what works well for you. Well, our questions seem to be slowing down here, so I think we're gonna wrap up here for you guys tonight. Like I said, if you guys have additional comments, questions, feel free to send them into the email there on the screen. Once this is down and reposted back, the live stream's down and the video comes up on YouTube, feel free to post it as a comment there on YouTube, or send it in info@Miller Welds, Shop Talk Live at Miller Welds. One way or the other, it will get back to us, so we appreciate that. And again, we'll be back. Send us some ideas for what you guys want to see for content. We want to structure these to what the questions that you guys have in the field truly are. So you'll see us back again. And I appreciate your time tonight. And hopefully you guys join us on the next version of the Shop Talk Live. So have a good night, and thank you very much for joining tonight. Have a good night.
Good night.